Hello and welcome to Mondays at Mount Olive for March 17th, 2025, the second week in Lent. Happy Monday. I'm Pastor Dan Torkelson, Senior Pastor at Mount Olive Lutheran Church here in Madison, Wisconsin. If you're from the area, I hope you were enjoying last week's marvelous weather. 75 or so degrees on Friday. I was outside doing a lot of things. It was good to get some fresh air in my lungs, although I noticed that the air quality took a turn for the worse from late Friday into Saturday. We even had troubles in the building here with some really smoky, like burning leaf smells. We eventually got rid of them, but at the end of the day, something was blowing around later in the day, but it was still gorgeous outside. It was wonderful. Also, if you're like me, I hope you're recovering from yesterday's disappointing loss to Michigan. Bucky's in the tournament. That's all that matters. Jonathan and I went to our first Badgers basketball game ever back in, I think it was December. It was the season home opener for the Big Ten season against, of all teams, Michigan, and they lost that game too. So Jonathan and I are starting to take that personally. We're still planning to watch in the tournament, although we might get superstitious and decide they do better when we don't. But anyway, you can let me know if you think we should not watch, but they're in the tournament. That's all that matters. This week's is going to be a more brief podcast. We had a wonderful Sunday yesterday, thanks to our Sunday school children. We also didn't have adult Bible study, so I'm just going to talk a little bit today about Lent, the second week in Lent, and we're going to take on a subject that I'm going to take 3 weeks to sort of fully unpack because it builds out of our discussion with regard to Lent 2 in the first place. The weeks in Lent, actually a number of the weeks of the church year, but especially the weeks in Lent are actually known or have been known throughout history by their Latin names. And those Latin names come from the first words of the introit. The introit typically in the service is right after the absolution. We've been not doing the introit in favor of doing a psalm setting between the Old Testament and epistle readings, but the introit has this verse that's repeated at the beginning, at the end. That's called the antiphon, and that is a theme verse for every week of the church year, as there are introits for every week of the church year. The first word of that verse constitutes the Latin name for all the weeks of Lent, and this week's is reminiscere, which is, you can probably figure that one out if you think about it. Reminiscere is the Latin term for remembering, and it's taken from Psalm 25, verse 6, which is that repeated verse, that antiphon. Remember your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. What's interesting about remembrance in the Bible is that God never fails to remember. God always remembers. One could argue that the law side of that is that he never forgets. But interestingly, in choosing to remember us the way he remembers us, he does choose to forget. When God remembers, he remembers to forgive. That word is always tied to the forgiveness of sins. When God remembers us, we even pray that in some of our communion services. So remember us in your kingdom and teach us to pray means be ready to forgive us. And that's right after we talk about how in the Lord's Supper we remember all that Jesus did for us. He remembers us by forgiving us. Sinners, on the other hand, those of us born with a sinful nature, we forget to remember. We forget too easily. And what we especially forget too easily is that God is a God of remembering, which is to say God is a God of forgiving. So sinners find it very hard to forgive. We sometimes forget to do it. Sometimes we often excuse ourselves from doing it, excuse ourselves out of it. It raises an interesting question: which is harder, to forgive or to be forgiven by someone else? We had that discussion, interestingly, at Men at Work this month. Which was harder, Esau forgiving Jacob or Jacob living in Esau's forgiveness? Tricky question, believe it or not. It's very hard to do both, and I actually kind of land on when you have to be forgiven by someone else, that is a very hard thing to do. I think it's harder than forgiving someone else, especially like, I can forgive my kids all the time, and I do, but if someone else wrongs me, it's a little harder to do. I'll confess that, and I think that's true of all of us, but to be forgiven by someone else when we did the wronging, when we sinned against them, that is a hard thing to live in, and that's a big part of Lent 2, the second week in Lent. Our two readings that we had in the service yesterday were the Old Testament and the Gospel, and they marry very well together. In Jeremiah 26, the leaders of Judah, of the southern kingdom, start plotting against Jeremiah. They start plotting to persecute him because he's a faithful preacher. And in Luke 13, there's also a threat that's issued to Jesus, that Herod wants to kill Jesus. And neither Jeremiah nor Jesus back down, and at least in that moment, nothing happens. The work goes on. It has something of a happy ending, although in both cases, they point out something that's kind of a painful lesson. And in Lent, we're sort of no pain, no gain. So what I have to say here is, interestingly, in both cases, it applies to Israel, which is to say it applies to God's people. We in the church have to bear these things in mind more than the world out there does. That's the hard thing about Lent. Lent is not our time to sit and complain about the rest of the world. Lent is our time to focus on our own sins. And what we see happening in Jeremiah 26 and Luke 13 is that Israel, forgetting to remember God's remembering of them, his salvation of them, starts to persecute Jeremiah and Jesus in both these texts. Israel behaves more like, I'd say, modern politicians, or even more like the modern world today and all of our judgmentalism and our cancel culture, than like the people of God. The people of God do not behave this way. They are afraid, by the way, these religious leaders in both cases. What they're most afraid of is losing their influence. The church is not God's church for them anymore. It's their church. And that's a big problem in the church throughout the years. It happens in congregations to this day, where some people take their influence more seriously than anything else. And if that influence is questioned, or if that influence is starting to die out, which happens over generational courses, or the course of maybe see decisions made by the body, or faithful preaching, that sometimes brings down influence as well. Those people who are afraid of losing their influence will start to threaten and maybe start to persecute those who are faithful. I've seen whole congregations that were afraid of a few leaders. I've seen pastors get into that boat too. And it's important to notice that Jeremiah, he's not happy about this persecution, but he doesn't back down. And Jesus just outright challenges it. And he's challenging people who will tell you they are the people of God. They're not non-believers. They're just badly misguided in what they think their faith means. The application is to the church. That's the hard thing about it. These threats and persecutions have no place in the church of Christ. And actually, misbegotten ideas of influence have no place in the church of Christ, because it is not our church. It belongs to him. The worst attitude in the church is what I would call me and my church, that sort of way of thinking. That sort of way of thinking writes Jesus out of the equation and often prohibits churches from doing some of the best things they can do, to grow, to reach out, to do all the things that Christ wants them to do. It does sometimes turn into a matter of what some people want over against what Jesus commands his church to do. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with a pastor friend of mine who has a call right now. And he had contacted me, and he wanted to talk to me because he wanted to know how my thought process went for when I had the call here at Mount Olive. And he's in a place where he could keep going, or it might be a good time to go, and he's having a hard time telling which would be better. And I said to him, one of the things that freed me up last time around was I was finally, I think, at a place in my own life where I was starting to figure out that neither church, the church I was currently serving when you called me, nor you, Mount Olive, needs me. I was at peace with that for the first time in my career. For the first time in my time as a pastor, I was at peace with the idea that the church does not need Dan Torkelson. The church needs Jesus. Unfortunately, what Lent 2 reminds us is that this isn't just a problem that pastors sometimes struggle with. This is a problem that Christians struggle with. A lot of times Christians in their own churches think their churches need them when they need Jesus. And that is what Lent 2 is designed to go after. The religious leaders decide, like we heard from Caiaphas a week and a half ago on Ash Wednesday, it'd be better for Jesus to die than for them to lose their influence, which is exactly what evil looks like. And yes, it happens in the church. So you heard me say yesterday about how we in the church need to kick the world out. We need to we need to tell the world where to go. When you walk in the doors of our church, and you're out there in the narthex, you should be having a certain kind of conversation. And so often churches fail in this regard. They talk about worldly things like politics, or they have extended board meetings. All of it is not good. It just isn't. It'd be better for us to use that time to love and care for one another and leave it at that, especially on Sundays. But anytime I think you walk in the doors, be ready to leave the world out there and let being in the church be being in Jesus' presence in Jesus' church. That sets up what I wanted to start today, a 3-week series on the gospel. It's called What is the Gospel? And today I'm going to make it very, very simple. This is going to get more detailed as time goes on. But the reason I'm going to make it simple is I'm going to build off what we've just been talking about. You would think, and I think a lot of Christians mistakenly think, that we're good on the gospel. We don't need the reminder. Except we are the ones who always forget how good God is to us. We're the ones who make those sins. We're in the season of Lent, and this is the time of year where we as Christians who are still sinners, take a good long look at that black heart and realize how often we've forgotten how good and gracious and loving our God really is. It happens as easily as when we start talking about ourselves, or we start becoming more concerned about ourselves, like I was just talking about with regard to influence, than we should be. It's really all about who's doing the verbs. It was one of the most interesting ways I learned when I was in college, long before I got into seminary, of figuring out the difference between the law and the gospel. We know they're opposites. The law tells us what to do and what not to do. And by the way, our sinful natures, wired the way we are now with these sinful natures, our minds grasp the law. We get the law. In fact, sometimes we want the law. It's the gospel that is beyond our way of thinking. That's God's heart. It's God's mind. And the mind of Christ doesn't develop just because you got baptized. The making of disciples is baptizing and teaching, and the mind of Christ is developed over time through teaching and more teaching. This is why I tell people they should be in Bible study. That's more important. The only thing more important than Bible study in the church is the divine service on Sunday morning. That's where the gifts are, and that's week 3 of the study, where we talk about why gifts are so important and why we're bad about getting them sometimes. But the gospel is all about who's doing the verbs. If I'm doing the verbs, if I'm praising God, if I'm praying, if I'm believing, if I'm, doing everything, that can sound really wonderful, but it is still always the law. Because the gospel is what God does for us, what God, and we need to drop all the time references. In other words, it's what God did for us in the past, to be sure. It's what God does for us today, to be sure, and it's what God will continue to do for us, leading into Christ's return and after into eternity. The gospel is timeless. And so if I am the subject of any verbs in the way I talk, that's going to be the law, no matter what. If God is a subject, well, it could still be the law. I mean, if God condemns unrepentant sinners, that is the law. But when we talk about God loving the world so much that he gave his one and only Son, John 3:16, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life, that's gospel. When we talk about Jesus saying, as Jonathan has picked for his confirmation verse, John 14, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. That's gospel. That's Jesus telling us what he's giving us. It is there in the gifts. God's love, God's grace, all of that is gospel. And it is centered on Jesus on the cross. Jesus does on the cross what none of us can do. Jesus earns for us salvation, and that is the gospel in a nutshell. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. So, in Lent 2, when we're talking about how Israel itself, the people who thought of themselves as God's people themselves, were really more about themselves than about God. That's a daily reality in the life of sinners. When we sin, we essentially say we're more important than God every time we do it, which is why every sin ultimately winds up being a violation of the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. If I steal something, you could say that whatever it was I was trying to steal was my false god, and you'd be right. But I want that for me too, and that's the big false god. The big false god is always me. To have a sinful nature pits us against God. The gospel is that God, as the angels announced when Jesus was born, is all about making peace with human beings that seem to want to go to war with God every day, and that includes us Christians who are at the same time saint and sinner. And in Lent, we concentrate on that sinner side. We look at those things that we fall into every day that cause us to go to war with God. The good news is he is a gracious God. When we repent and come to him sorrowful and humble, remembering that our life is not our life, it's the life he gave us. The forgiveness is not our forgiveness, it's the forgiveness he gives us. The church that we get to rejoice in is not our church, it's his church. And it would not be any better than the Lions Club if it was ours. In other words, and no knock on the Lions Club, I was once a Lion, and I still support their work. But the fact of the matter is, the church is different. It's different from any other worldly organization because it has the gospel. Next week, we're going to talk about what makes the gospel so special. But at the very beginning here, let's understand that if we're talking about ourselves at all, if we're concerned about ourselves at all, that's going to be the law, and ultimately it's going to be a reflection of our sinful nature. But when God comes first, when Jesus comes first in everything, and obviously we're not going to do that perfectly every day, but what we try to do at the church level is we try to put him first in everything we think, say, and do. When he comes first in everything we think, say, and do, well, then you've got a church that's trying to be as much gospel as it possibly can be. And that's the best you can do in this life, because the church still bears the marks of sin. You still see sinful behaviors in the church every day. Christians don't like to hear that. Lent tells us a lot of things we don't like to hear because the Bible tells us a lot of things we don't like to hear. Jesus was getting threats not because he was Mr. Popular for what he was saying. And that's very, very important. But if we love one another, if we reflect God's love for us, we'll speak the truth. We'll preach the truth. Because love always rejoices in the truth. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 6. We speak the truth in love to one another. The truth is that the gospel is the best thing on earth. It is the best product that any business could have, and the church is so much better than a business. The church is a church. It's its own thing. It's defined by the gospel. And when it remembers the gospel, or when God causes it to remember the gospel is probably the better way to say it, it's the best place, safest place, most wonderful place that you can possibly be. So when you come in the doors on Sunday morning, or any other time of the week, leave the world out there. The world clearly doesn't know how badly it's doing these days. So it doesn't belong in here, that's for sure. We've got something better. And we're going to talk about that better message next week. Well, that's the conclusion. I said it'd be shorter. That's the conclusion of Mondays at Mount Olive for this week. We will get into Lent 3 next week. That one, the Latin term is oculi. And if you think a little bit, you might be able to figure that out. So that's your test for this week. What does the word oculi mean in Latin? And I'll look forward to seeing you then. God's blessings.